Thanks, Ian. Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to talk to you today about a recent driving campaign which has been launched as a result of my PhD research, which I completed a few years ago at Swansea University. Now, I know looking around the room, some people may have already been kind enough and been interested to complete one of two surveys which have been posted online, looking at people's experiences of giving up driving, whether you're a member of the public, a family, friend, neighbour of an older adult, or a member of a local authority or voluntary organisation. So if you've already completed one of the surveys, I'd like to thank you for doing so. But as I talk about today's presentation and some of my findings, I'm hoping that by doing this, more people will complete one of the two surveys following the presentation. Now, before I talk about the campaign which has been launched, which was in May 2022 last year, I wanted to give you a very brief overview of my research and why I undertook it. So looking at giving up driving, it is a hugely overlooked area in ageing research. Although the outcomes of giving up driving are very similar to other major later life transitions, such as bereavement or loss of a spouse in later life, or retirement from the workplace. And a lot of the outcomes, unfortunately, are primarily negative. So depression, isolation, reduced out-of-home activities, and an overall reduction in quality of life for older adults. Now, although the study did reveal, obviously, the impacts on older people when they give up driving, another part of my research looked at the impact on the informal support network around an older adult. So when we talk about informal support, that would be a spouse, a sister, a brother, a child, an adult child, or a grandchild who may provide informal support in the way of lifts, so getting from A to B, or doing shopping for an older adult, picking up prescriptions, taking them out for social needs as well. So that's what my research looked at, the impact on the older person and those who may or may not provide support to older people. Now, just to say what I did, this research was taken a few years ago, and it was taken with 17 older people. So the ages ranged from 60 to 87. And 15 members of older people's informal support network were interviewed as well. And I undertook individual semi-structured interviews in people's homes or in public places, cafes, pubs, that sort of thing. And I did a thematic analysis as well of people's findings. Now, what I wanted to outline and what part of my findings showed was why informal support is so important when an older person gives up driving. So although when somebody does give up driving, I know there are options such as public transport, mainly using the bus, using the train, walking, and using private transport mainly, or community transport. But the reason why informal support is so important is because that is the closest thing to somebody driving themselves. So being able to sit comfortably in a car to get from A to B. And older people also talked about having social contact and company with another person. Because many people, when they give up driving, they do experience loneliness as well. And people also talked about how expensive private transport is. So taxis were a no-go for some older people, especially the way things are today. Lots of older people claiming pension credit and that sort of thing, especially now with the cost of living. And also with informal support, it's not just something that may take place once an older person gives up driving. It's something that is often there before, during giving up driving and afterwards. So there's an element of continuity for people as well. And lots of older people have very negative experiences of using public transport. So things such as when they get on the bus driver not waiting for them to sit down before they pull off, worried about their balance, fear of falling, lots of different things. Now, findings in terms of what older people said about using informal support as an alternative for giving up driving. Again, even though that is the main alternative to driving themselves, outcomes were quite negative. So older people talked about feeling guilty by asking maybe a son or a daughter who has a really important and busy life, an important job, lots of things going on in their own lives, feeling guilty because they needed their support to get places. And also I talked about getting for me to be hospital appointments, going shopping. What happens with informal support is it's mainly those practical needs that get met for an older person. So things such as wanting a lift to go to the cinema or going into town just to have a nose around, and not actually do anything practical or necessary, actually go largely unmet when somebody gives up driving, because many people talked about, I can't just phone my son and say, I fancy a trip to the beach today. And then if he's in work, obviously it's not really viable to be able to do that. They talked about being a burden for those reasons, being really aware that informal support network members have lots of different roles and responsibilities placed upon them. And as a result of all this, older people have a reduced amount of spontaneity, choice and autonomy over their own lives and where they want to go and meeting their travel needs. Now, what my research did is something that hasn't been very much explored to date up until when I did my research. And as I said, that was to speak to those who provide the support and get their perspectives or experiences of how it's affected them. So it was sons, daughters, not so much spouses, because obviously older people, they were a similar age if it was a husband and wife and they had lots of shared interests and common things going on. But it was family members, even neighbours and friends, and they did talk about feeling an increased sense of responsibility, more stress and more anxiety in their own lives. And they also talked about role conflict. So one example was a son talking about how his mum is calling him all the time and saying, I need to go here, I need to go there, this is what I need to be done. And then he talked about how he would be arguing with his wife and feeling this sense of responsibility really, and trying to balance everything was causing him a huge sense of stress and anxiety. They also felt guilty for not being able to provide the amount of support that the older person needed. So feeling like, you know, I know they are really depressed, I know they are lonely, but there's only so much time that I have to be able to do this. Members were also frustrated because of the levels of stress they were feeling. And many people introduced coping strategies, which I thought was really interesting. So things such as, I've needed to speak to my wife or my children to say, look, mum or dad needs extra support and I need to be able to provide that. Also doing things such as speaking to members of their own informal network to try and reduce the amount of pressure that they're feeling, and also talking to their workplaces to try and introduce flexible working in their own lives to be able to meet the needs of their older parent or sister or brother or spouse, whatever it may be. Now, what was stark really, when I did my research, like I said, it was a few years ago, I looked at what support was available to date. Because when I was interviewing older people, I wanted to provide support leaflets and contact numbers if they were giving up driving, somewhere for them to go really, to know what to do once they've given up the keys. But support really isn't really out there at all, and it is patchy at best. So most of the support interventions are online, and many of the older people, especially I'd say from the age 80 onwards in my study, didn't have access to the internet and didn't know where to go. And they talked about not knowing what to do, basically. Age UK, for example, there is a web page based on what people should do when giving up driving. But again, you are relying on somebody going online for you, which many older people didn't have access to. And as it says, this is where I need your help. So people in the audience, you know, organisations and members of the public as well. So the intervention, as I've talked about the campaign, it was launched in May 2022. Now, following that, I went on maternity leave, and I'm still on maternity leave. So I haven't really been able to follow this campaign very closely because I've been off. I do return in May this year. So what I'd ask, this is what I'd like to do really, is ask people to really get involved in this, to get feedback. So when I return in a few months, I'll have more responses to work with to take this to the next stage. But what I've done with the campaign, we did announcements and advertisements on different websites, different organisations have shared links to this, and on radios as well. And there's basically two surveys, as I've said. So one is for voluntary organisations or local authorities to talk about whether or not they currently provide support for mobility and transport needs. Many don't, as I'll show you in a moment, for a number of reasons. And the other one is for older people themselves or members of the public in general. So it may be a family, friend, neighbour of an older person whose perspective I'd like to get as well. Now, today, just to very briefly cover what the findings have been. For local area coordinators and voluntary organisations, there have been 16 responses. And out of those responses, 5 councils or charities, organisations do provide support for older people's mobility and transport needs, and 8 do not. And this is just a quote. I had many quotes included. I just wanted to show you one. And that was by somebody who said, I spoke to a lady at a coffee morning who had lost confidence in driving. So refresher lessons for older adults would be great, especially for people who have had bereavement and their partner used to be the main driver. So people working with older adults are aware of this issue, and I know a lot of the time it goes down to funding, especially again under the current circumstances, but it's to show that there is an awareness out there. It's just nothing, unfortunately, is being put into place for many areas across Wales. And for the members of the public, just to show you the 27 responses, 21 of those people who responded were drivers, older drivers, and 6 were non-drivers, which shows that when older people are still driving, they are actually thinking about support and what they're going to do once they can no longer drive. And you can see the main response rates were the categories 61 to 70 and age 71 to 80. So it was really positive to get feedback from older people themselves. And this was quite stark with the findings so far. And this is basically asking, is there any information in your area regarding what you should do when giving up driving? And every single one of those responses, the 27, was no. So nobody knows about where to go or what to do. And that finding is just demonstrating that. Now, part of the survey asks people just to note what support they would like when they can no longer drive. So these were some of the categories which were found, and these were reported by a number of respondents as well. So people talked about wider door-to-door transport options, so something that basically mimics driving yourself. And I know obviously in larger cities like London and even Bristol and Cardiff, there is Uber, and people talked about wanting that in areas like Swansea or smaller areas like Carmarthenshire and more rural areas in Wales, because they wanted services which were friendly and flexible. People need a regular increased bus service. And they also want a service, like I said, which is personalised, like booking a taxi, but which doesn't cost as much, which maybe some subsidies included. But they can just call a number and say, I need to get to here a certain time, and there's an option to have door-to-door transport. People talk about needing a list of services and clear information about their transport options when they can no longer drive, and how to get from A to B in a rural area as well, because obviously bus services and things are limited in rural areas. A really important finding as well, or response from the survey, was that older people talked about needing a support group with other older people who are going through something similar. So somebody to talk to, and that's not necessarily online. It could be a community support group, just someone that they can share ideas of best practice with, and just generally have a chat about what they're going through and how to manage. And before I finish, just to give some other feedback which has been included on the surveys, it's just basically reiterating the fact that people don't know what to do when they give up driving. There's no support available. One respondent said, I've never been notified or had knowledge of any help on offer. And this lady, this really stuck out for me, who's quoted, I recently gave up driving. I am 80 on medication for long-term mobility and decided I should no longer drive. I am a carer for my husband who has mobility issues, so we are now housebound, very depressing. And that is the reality for many people who I spoke to in my study as well. It's just having this fulfilled lifestyle, being able to go where they want to go. And then all of a sudden, with not being able to drive, they are just housebound and the whole quality of life is damaged. And then somebody else just said, I'm currently still able to drive, but looking at giving up in the future, and I would really appreciate some help with transport. So for the campaign, the next steps are, well, being here today, as I've already said, talking to you about this, but it's to connect with more local area coordinators across Wales and voluntary organisations. And I'd like to hold a workshop when I'm back off maternity leave with members of those different organisations, because ideally what I would like to do is contact the DVLA, because when somebody gives up the driving licence, that's the main point of contact in the UK. So that organisation really does have a huge role to play in terms of being a signposter to possibly send out information for people. And I'd also like to take the research further afield and look at international policies, what's going on. And I know I have worked with some of the members of the University of Malaysia who are here today and talked about your studies as well. And I'd also like to get public feedback using workshops and this kind of thing, which is happening today, and just get genuine, honest answers really as to what people need and what people want to help. And I've asked Kim as well at the back, thank you, if you would send out the survey to all members today, because we have your email addresses. So I would really appreciate it if everybody could get involved to give your feedback so we can take this to the next stage and basically help people. So thanks for listening.